Well, hello, welcome. I'm glad that you're here with us again today as we continue our chronological read through of the Bible. As we begin our reading today, we're told that Samuel has died. It's actually kind of interesting that we receive this news literally 3 verses after Saul finally acknowledges that David will be king in his place. That acknowledgement, of course, doesn't stop Saul from seeking to kill David, but he does admit the validity of Samuel's anointing of David as king. We're told that all of Israel gathered and mourned Samuel. That's not said of anyone else in the Bible. Certainly, Samuel was one of the most important prophets, or was the most important prophet since Moses. Well, David leaves the stronghold that he's been staying in, and he goes with his men and their families to the wilderness of Paran in southern Judah. This puts Dave and his men in close proximity with the herds of a wealthy man by the name of Nabal. Now, it would have been very common in those days for herders to lose stock to what we would call, rustlers today, I guess. But David's men didn't take anything from Nabal's herds, and their presence protected Nabal's herdsmen from others who wouldn't be as scrupulous as David and his men were. So when it came time to shear the sheep, there would have been a large stock of provisions at the shearing camp. So David took the opportunity to ask for some supplies from Nabal for his men. Now, David's request was made through his men. It was deferential. It was polite. Nabal's response, it was arrogant. It was harsh. He accused David of being disloyal to Saul, of deserting Saul. And then he continued to insult the men who had brought the message from David. So on receiving Nabal's response, David takes 2/3 of his men, 400 of his men, to go and deal with Nabal. For Nabal had repaid good with evil, actually the same thing that Saul was doing to David. Meanwhile, one of the young shepherds goes to Nabal's wife Abigail and relates what's happened. He confirmed to her the protection that David's men had provided to them in the wilderness, and he asked Abigail to take action because he feared that David's wrath would fall on Nabal and all of his household. It's fascinating that both Abigail and the young shepherd, were not in the least bit shy about referring to Nabal as good for nothing and as foolish. Certainly gives us a measure of the man's character. Well, Abigail sets out immediately to gather up some supplies of food and to go out and meet David. She's sure that he will be coming to deal with Nabal and his whole family. When she meets David, she bows before him as king. She blames the insult that he received on herself. She argues that Nabal he's just worthless and he's below David's contempt. In other words, don't waste your time on such a fool. She even notes that through her, God is keeping David from bloodshed. Finally, she asks for forgiveness and forecasts that David's dynasty will be lasting and that God will fulfill every good thing he had promised David. In summary, if David would accept her gift, needless bloodshed and guilt would be avoided. Well, David does accept her offer, noting that it was only her quick and prudent action that prevented him from carrying out an oath that to that point he had only considered, he had not yet spoken. David then sent her home with an assurance of peace. Well, when Abigail gets home, Nabal, who had refused to give anything to David, was overindulging in a feast. He was drunk. So Abigail waited until the next day to tell Nabal what she had done. Well, when Nabal heard the news, he apparently took it very poorly. He became unresponsive to others. Whether it was from a medical condition or it was out of anger and petulance, we really don't know. 10 days later, Nabal dies at the hand of the Lord. David then, when he hears about this, David proposes to Abigail, who accepts. The text at this point also mentions that there was another woman, Ahinoam, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce her name, who was married to David. That would have been his second wife after Michal, Saul's daughter. Now, by the way, while David's on the lam in the wilderness, Saul gave Michal to another man, probably or possibly in a bid to weaken David's claim to the throne. Of course, that was kind of a hopeless, although very insulting, gesture because it's God himself who had given David his claim to the throne. And David actually will eventually demand and receive Michal back while he is while he is consolidating his kingdom and returning to the throne. So anyway, at the end of the chapter here, we see that at this point in time, David has, well, I guess you could say three wives. Obviously, Michal is first, and then Ahinoam, and now Abigail. Now, back to the tough situation at hand. The Ziphites schemed to turn David and his men over to Saul. By the way, Nabal was a Ziphite as well. When Saul arrives at the invitation of the Ziphites, God puts him and his men into a deep sleep, and David and another man walk right into the camp and take Saul's spear and water bottle as everyone's sleeping. From a distance, then he calls out to Saul, and once again he demonstrates that he doesn't seek Saul's death, but only his own life. David only wants to be spared his own life. Saul once again admits his sin. He actually prays for David's blessing and asserts that David will be successful, and he goes on his way. It appears that this is the last time that the two of them meet, I guess if you could call that a meeting. The last two of them interact. The last chapter we read today, chapter 27, sets the scene for the final conflict, or begins to set the scene for the final conflict between Saul and the Philistines. David moves his 600 men and their families to Gath again, and he offers his services to King Achish, a different King Achish than the one that was there before. Situation is very different now. David's not alone. He was earlier. The new King Achish gives David a city, Ziklag, which is outside of Gath itself. The king surely expects that David is going to be helpful to him when the Philistines take Saul on again. The Philistines are preparing to do this. So he's thinking ahead a little bit here. David is correct in assuming that Saul will stop pursuing him when he's in the Philistine territory. So in that, I guess, relative peace, David begins conducting raids on the Geshurites and the Amalekites. But he leads Achish to believe that he's conducting raids on various sites in Judah. Achish comes to trust David, assuming that David is making himself repugnant to his own people, and therefore is really going to have to be Achish's servant permanently. This goes on for about a year and 4 months, but you're going to have to come back tomorrow to find out what happens next. So things are moving along here. May God be with you, bless you. I pray that you continue to learn and to grow, that as you see how God protects David and works in David's life, you would see how God protects and works in your life as well, or at least you would be more open to looking at seeing how God protects and works in your life as well. May God be with you, bless you. I look forward to meeting with you again tomorrow.